Hello, this is Doug Kaye, and it's quite an honor to be selected as one of the first round of Arcanum Masters. So I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about my personal background and my own approach to photography. Along the way here, I'm going to include some of my images, and rather than describe them in detail, how they were made and so forth, I'm just going to let them run as a montage and let them give an impression of the kind of work that I've done in the past. Like so many other photographers, I got my start in my father's darkroom. We had a wet darkroom in the basement, all black and white. I love the process. There's really nothing quite like seeing that print come out on paper in a tray of developer. Really love that. In college, my undergraduate degree was in theatrical lighting design. And after college, I went on to work in theater, feature films, and commercials in San Francisco. After a couple of years of doing that, I decided I wanted to learn more about filmmaking. So I moved to New York City and went to NYU, where I studied cinematography in grad school. All along, I had still my own darkroom. I did black and white as well as Cibachrome. And after graduate school, I worked as a documentary filmmaker, spent a little bit of time working in news as well. But I actually made my living as a motion picture sound editor and recording engineer. I had a long background in audio up at that point, and that was my primary source of income. I also had a chance to learn about film chemistry, working at a major New York City film lab for a few years. And then I made a big career change. I decided to go into computer software and started my own business. Ran that for about 18 years. Along the way, my wife and I moved back to California. And in 1996, I sold that business and decided to work my way down the corporate ladder. So I became the chief technology officer for 4 internet.com startups over a period of just 4 years. In 2000, I actually retired, became a, quote, consultant, wrote a few books, pursued a number of other interests, and I had the opportunity then to get back into photography after being away from it for almost 25 years. So today we're living in Marin County, California, just north of San Francisco, and I am a full-time photographer. Although I occasionally sell prints, most of my photography-related income is actually from teaching photography. In fact, most of my photography time is spent teaching. I probably spend quite a bit more time teaching than actually working on my own images. I teach general photography, as well as post-processing with Lightroom and Photoshop. I'm very active with competitions in the local photo club, where I'm also running the Advanced Photoshop Special Interest Group, and I lead a lot of photo walks here in Northern California. You may know me as an occasional guest on the This Week in Photo podcast with Frederick Van Johnson, and I'm also the co-host of a show with Frederick called All About the Gear, where we review cameras and other pieces of photographic equipment. One question I'm asked all the time is, what gear do I myself use? And the answer is that I'm sort of permanently in transition. My large cameras, my DSLRs, are all Nikons for no particular reason. It just got started that way. I have a large D3S, which I love, a D800E, and a Nikon D600 as the sort of backup camera for the other two. But more recently, I've gotten very involved with mirrorless cameras. For All About the Gear, I've reviewed everything from Panasonic, Olympus, Fuji, and I ended up buying Sony equipment. The NEX6, NEX7, and now the Alpha 7 are Alpha 7 is probably my go-to camera most of the time these days. But by the time you hear this, who knows, I may be on to something else. So what do I shoot, and how would you describe my photography? Well, technically, I guess you'd call me a fine art photographer, but I admit that's a bit of a catch-all. I don't do photo assignments for hire. It's all work that I choose to do for myself. I don't do weddings. I don't do many model shoots. I've done virtually no fashion photography. Most of my images are street photography, travel photography, and architecture. And that's what I think you see represented here in the images I'm showing you. So what is my philosophy of photography, and what are you going to learn from me if you're in one of my spheres? At some point, every photographer makes the transition from taking snapshots to making photographs. It's a phrase you'll hear quite often, and it's a very important distinction, I think. A snapshot is meant to preserve a memory, and it's of particular value to you and the others who are with you at the time that you take the picture. That image will remind you not only of what's within the frame, but also what's outside the frame. And that includes the third dimension, the sounds, the smells of the scene, the things that were actually going on beyond what's simply going to end up in the photograph. But when you make a photograph, you're creating something for people who won't have those memories or associations. You can only communicate with those people via what's inside this two-dimensional rectangle. There's no third dimension. There's no sound. There's no smells. There's none of the heat, the cold, or the dampness that you may have experienced while you were actually taking the shot. So your job as a photographer is very different from the snapshot taker, let's say. If you're a news or documentary photographer, it's probably your job to communicate all of those sensations as accurately as possible, to include those somehow in the image. If you're a fashion photographer or product or food photographer, then it's your job to create those sensations for the viewer, even though they may never have existed in the studio. You want something to look and feel and smell and taste a particular way, and it might all be fake. In my photography, I take on the role somewhere between documentation and fantasy. I think of my role as being an interpreter, adding something of my own to what I observe in the real world. I rarely make up something completely out of the blue. I almost always start with something that I discover, but I also rarely try to reproduce reality as reality. My goal is to create something brand new that's based on the things that I discover. And my first goal with my students is to help them make those discoveries, to actually see what otherwise they might have missed by just looking at the scene. An interesting scene becomes the raw material for your exposure. And from there, I teach my students how best to capture what they see, which is more of a technical process, and that becomes the raw material, an image, for the next step, which is post-production in either Lightroom or Photoshop. Now, some photographers think there should be little or no tweaking of their images once they're captured. In journalism, that's generally the rule. You're not really allowed to make any adjustments. You can't, add clouds to an empty blue sky, for example. And sometimes when I'm shooting, I'll know ahead of time what I'm going to do in post-production. For example, I might see a scene and decide that it's going to become a black and white print, and I might compose and expose with that very much in mind. But more often, I look at what I've captured after the fact, and I use that as a starting point. It's the raw material again for the next step, just as I use the real world as the raw material for the photograph that I took. In the end, I may end up expressing something that's quite similar to what I observed, or I may create something entirely different. That's what I mean when I say my photography is interpretational. Well, that's all we have time for in this short video. I look forward to working with as many of you in the Arcanum as possible. And with that, I'll just say thanks for watching.